Hi and welcome to So You Think You Can Yoga's Vloga session. So the other day I talked extensively about the 3 planes of movement in my last post. I believe it was my last post. So I went into great detail about what those 3 planes of movement are and explained, fully. So maybe you want to go back and check that out. But today I want to talk to you a little bit about how those planes of movement apply to your practice and how you can actually start to think about the 3 planes of movement as you move, as you practice. And we're going to explore the 3 planes of movement relative to Virabhadrasana 2, which is a pose that's practiced very commonly in most power yoga or vinyasa classes. So if you've ever taken like a power yoga or vinyasa class, I'm pretty sure, 99.9% sure that you've done Virabhadrasana 2. So just to recap, the 3 planes of movement are coronal, and that's the plane of movement in which you look at the movement happening from the front. So it appears to the viewer as movement happening side to side. So that would be adduction or abduction. Okay, that's coronal. That's happening from the front. Then we have transverse plane of movement, which if you were to draw a plumb line or a median line from head to toe, and anything that rotates around that median, around its own axis, is transverse plane of movement. And a good indicator, kind of a key word to listen for when you're taking a yoga class, is rotation. So anything that involves rotation happens in this plane of movement, and that's called transverse plane. And then the last plane of movement is sagittal. So in the sagittal plane, it's best viewed from the side, from the profile. So for example, if I were to stick my butt out like this, or tuck my tailbone under me, this is happening in the sagittal plane, right? If I were to drop my chin towards my chest or take my neck back, that's happening in the sagittal plane. Walking happens in the sagittal plane because it's movement that happens front to back. So that's why it's best viewed from the side. Extending your leg forward or lifting your leg up towards the torso or extending the leg back behind you also happens in the sagittal plane. Okay? So those are the 3 planes of movement. So let's take Virabhadrasana 2. So keeping your hands on your hips, just for right now, you're going to turn onto your, let's take the right side first. So spin onto your right heel, drop your right toes down, and look to see that your right heel lines up with your left arch. Yeah? And then making sure that you set up your pose properly from the ground up. And then as you take your inhale, you're going to slowly bend your right knee. And as you bend your right knee, pull your right hip back. Rotate, externally rotate the right hip underneath you, right? Pull it towards your back heel. And that's happening in the transverse plane. So your right hip is externally rotating, transverse plane. Your pelvis, I see this a lot in Virabhadrasana 2 in my students. I see the pelvis tipped forward and it affects the entire upper body, right? So what you want to do is you want your pelvis to be neutral in the sagittal plane. And the way to bring it into neutral is to direct your tailbone towards your back heel, right, down, and that will lift your right hip off of your right thigh, creating space in your hip flexor, right? So your pelvis is going to be nice and like a bowl. If there was water in the bowl, it wouldn't spill, right? If your pelvis is not neutral in the sagittal plane, imagining that it's a bowl, the water would spill out, right? So you want the water in your bowl to stay level. And then coronal plane happens when you're bending the knee, right? This is movement that's viewed from the front. So you're seeing me bend the knee, tracking it over the second and third toes, right? Or if I were to take my arms up overhead and then bring them back down, that's coronal movement because that's being viewed from the front, and to the viewer it appears as if the movement is going side to side, right? This is happening side to side. So let's straighten out, take your hands to your hips, parallel the feet, and let's take the other side because we want to be balanced. So that's the whole point of yoga, is to achieve balance. So we're going to rotate on the left heel, drop your left toes down. Point your back toes in slightly. Look to see that your left heel lines up with your right arch. Take your hands to your hips so you can feel what you're doing with your pelvis. There's a lot that goes on in the pelvis in this pose. And it's a really good one to break down, especially when you're talking about the different planes of movement. So your left hip this time externally rotates. You're pulling the left hip back and underneath you. As you bend your left knee, right? Coronal plane, transverse plane rotation, coronal plane, opening out to the side, right? Pelvis, sagittal plane, you want it to be neutral. So direct your tailbone towards the ground, towards your back heel to lift up through your left hip, and then taking the arms out to the sides, pull your belly in, open up through the collarbones, and take a few breaths. And then once you're done, straighten out slowly. Take your hands to your hips and parallel the feet, and then just heel-toe your feet together. So I think it's really important to understand the 3 planes of movement, because when you walk, when you do any sort of physical movement or physical activity, you have to realize that you're not a paper doll. You're not, 2-dimensional, you're 3-dimensional. And yoga is lots of movement. So it's just really interesting to explore movement in this way, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll join me for my next Vloga session, which should be coming up soon. All right, so stay tuned.